Hey guys, BuildZoid here, and today we're going to be taking a look at the 1080 Ti Gaming Xtreme? Aorus Gaming Xtreme? Either way, the most high-end PCB that Gigabyte is using for their 1080 Ti. This is actually very I think they're going to be doing something very similar to what they did on the 1080, where all of the top of the line 1080s use the same PCB, and this in fact recycles a lot of that 1080 PCB, which you'll see that as soon as we dig into this. Now, there's a few issues here. Gigabyte PCBs, as you can probably tell right now, well, not Gigabyte well, yeah, Gigabyte generally has crowded PCBs, as in there's a lot of stuff everywhere, which makes it really, really hard for me to figure out where things are. And on this card, that means I'm not entirely sure on which of the supporting voltages are where, and I still not I think I'm missing a few voltages as well, just like straight up don't know where they are. So, you know, I'm not going to cover everything. I'm just going to cover everything. Quality is going to be down. I mean, who the hell cares? In the past, I would only go over the V-Core VRM and the memory VRM. Nobody complained, but since I started highlighting even the minor ones, I figured I'd point out that, like, this card, if I had the card in hand, I could just stab it with a multimeter to figure out where everything is, but I don't have it in hand. I only have a picture. So, with that out of the way, let's get right into it. So, first things first, identifying all those voltages that I can't find. This down here, luckily for me, hasn't changed. This is still the 1 volt PLL or PEX voltage, depending on which one you want to call it. It powers some of the internal PLLs of the GPU. It doesn't do anything when overclocking, like on air or water cooling, but on LN2 it might be worth tweaking this up or down for if you have like cold bug issues or something, then this voltage comes in handy on LN2. But for air cooling and water cooling, it doesn't do anything. Of course, the card won't operate without it, but, you know, it doesn't do, like, there's no reason to make this VRM particularly incredible, because it's a single phase. It's a tiny little pathetic single phase. The reason why it's that is because, well, you're never going to really have to worry about putting more power through that one. Behind that, we find the V-Core VRM, which I accidentally highlighted the capacitor bank for it, which I stopped doing, because the thing about highlighting capacitor banks is I'd like to be consistent, and sure, this is part of the V-Core VRM, but so are some of these capacitors around the GPU core, so I can't exactly, you know, go and highlight all of that. So that right there is V-Core, and that does take up most of the card. And behind that, we find the memory VRM, which is also laid out kind of weird. And then we find these 3 chokes down here, which I'm not entirely sure which one is which is the thing I'm complaining about. I think one of these might be a input filtering choke, but at the same time, I kind of doubt that, because all the other input filters are, well, these are the other input filters. So I find it kind of strange that suddenly you would have a much larger input, like a much larger filtering chokes than for the 8 pins. So yeah, but one of these over here is going to be 1.8 volts for the EEPROM and that kind of thing. There should also be another 1.8 volt VRM for the GDDR5X, and this card should require a 5 volt power supply. Requires a 5 volt power supply for the power stages in the V-Core VRM, which I also can't find. So that's probably all in there. The 5 volt VRM might actually be located elsewhere. I'm not entirely sure about that, but the 1.8 volt VRMs should be this right here. Now then, with that out of the way, let's take a closer look at the VRMs that I can actually identify, and then we'll move on to things like shunt modding this card. So for the V-Core VRM, these we're looking at a 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12 phase design, as we do also have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12 power stages. These are FD, and I have the datasheet on the wrong monitor, so this will be a bit awkward. FDMF 6823Cs. these are identical to the power stages and phase count to, like, this is the exact same VRM that Gigabyte used on the 1080 Water Force and the Gaming Xtreme 1080 and a bunch of the other 1080 cards. All of the 1080 cards with the 12-phase VRM are this VRM right here. The 1080 Ti gets this VRM again. The reason for that being the FDMF 6823Cs are rated for 50 amps at 125 degrees, assuming 300 kilohertz switching frequency. Which basically means that with a 12-phase VRM right here, we get a current capability of 600 amps for the GPU core, which on a 1080 Ti, on the regular 1080, that was ridiculous overkill. On a 1080 Ti, it's still ridiculous overkill, as the 1080 Ti does not pull a whole lot more power than a 1080 does. It's the 1080 is sort of like 170 amps. The 1080 Ti is over the 200 amp range for the core requirement, but still, you're not going to triple your current draw even under LN2 or dry ice cooling. It's just not going to happen. These cards aren't that power hungry. So this is ridiculous overkill. Interestingly enough, how does this compare to some of the other VRMs available on, say, other 1080 Ti's? It's significantly better than what the reference card comes with. It's the exact same current capability as the Strix, which is a 10-phase, which we'll get to that because there's some funky stuff going on with this 12-phase here, which if you've... I think I did a video of this card, of this VRM before for the 1080 Water Force for Gamers Nexus, where I talk about the fact that this VRM is a bit odd in how it's set up. But either way, it is a... So it's the same power capability as the 1080 Ti Strix, and the MSI Gaming X, I'm going to be doing that soon, but off the top of my head, I do believe this is more powerful than what the MSI Gaming X card comes with. Not that that really matters. As I said, this is ridiculous, like absolutely insane overkill for a 1080 Ti. So, power-wise, Gigabyte is set here. Now, actual regulation-wise, this thing is a little bit iffy, because this right here is a UP, and I can't write there, so I'll just drag that down here. That right there is a UP 9511, which should ring a lot of bells for anybody who's been watching the NVIDIA 10 series breakdowns, because this thing is used on pretty much every single high-end 1080 Ti, high-end NVIDIA card since forever. I mean, there's even 1060s with this voltage controller. This thing is an 8-phase that goes up to 600 kilohertz per phase. The problem is Gigabyte has 1, 2, 3 UP, and I can't write again. I should have really extended the canvas for this, shouldn't have I? Oh well, it's a UP 1911, and yeah, so these are UP 1911s. These are, I know for a fact that they can double, but I do believe they also include quadrupling capabilities. So what Gigabyte is actually doing here is they take three PWM signals from the voltage controller, shove it through the doublers, and out of the quadruplers, and get 4 phases in the actual VRM. The problem is, in the process, they go from 600 kilohertz switching frequency to 150 kilohertz switching frequency. So the end result is that you get better voltage regulation out of a lot of other 1080 Ti's. The Asus Strix with its 10-phase has 5 phases driving the doublers, driving a doubling scheme. That thing has, it updates the phases more often per second than this does. The MSI is a true 8-phase. That one updates its VRM more often than this one. The Founders Edition is a weird 7-8-phase monstrosity thing. That also has a theoretical, it has better control over the MOSFETs, and the power going through, the current going through each phase is better controlled on basically every other 1080 Ti out there. Will this significantly impact overclocking? No. From all the reviews we've seen, all the 1080 Ti's still clock exactly the same, which is keeping up with the 10 series trends, but you know, it's just something to keep in mind that if you did manage to load up this VRM to, like, say if you did actually try running LN2 or something, this VRM might end up underperforming compared to some other cards, but that would actually need practical testing. Also, the capacitor bank used on, you know, on the output side of a VRM plays a really big role in how well the voltage regulation of the VRM works, because even if you can't regulate the like if you can't control your phases very well, you can still use the capacitor bank to soak up any major, like any smaller mistakes the VRM might make as far as voltage regulation goes on the controller side. So, it's a, you know, it is a three-phase VRM running through quadruplers. It isn't necessarily the end of the world, even though you should generally stay away from quadrupling a three-phase, you know, a three-phase setup. So, yeah. But, like, it's, as far as power goes, the VRM is fine. Now then, moving on to the memory VRM, this is luckily a true two-phase design, and let's zoom in further. These right here are dual NFET, so dual NFETs. So that basically means there's two MOSFETs in each of these ICs, and these are FDMS3604Ss from Fairchild Semiconductor, so actually the same guys who make the power stages here. And these have 11 milliohms RDS on at 4.5 volts gate drive, and 3.5 millivolts RDS on for the low side at 3.5 volts gate drive. And I just noticed I made a mistake in my calculator, so let me fix that. There we go. And they did put, and since there are two of these in each phase, you end up with actually having 4 MOSFETs in each of the phases. End result is that, assuming 300 kilohertz switching frequency, 1.5 volts, and 125 degrees operating temperature, this right here can output 224 amps, assuming you can somehow manage to dissipate over 70 watts of heat. So that's not happening. But you could theoretically push, say, 100 amps through this VRM at relatively coolable. So that's like the 224 amps figure is like assuming you are not cooling limited. Like regardless of what happens, you can maintain VRM temperatures at 125 degrees. You could push 224 amps. However, more realistically, you're going to be looking at 100 amps, as that would only require a cooling capacity of about 17 watts for 125 degrees, which that's actually, like, this is actually doable, whereas that 224 figure requires over 70 watts of cooling capacity for the VRM heatsink. So no way you're doing that. Also, these chokes would probably melt if you tried to push that much current through each of them. Now, as far as what the VRM will actually be subject to, GDDR5X does not need a lot of power, and it runs on 1.35 volts. This is going to be really outputting about 30, like, GDDR5X is about, let's just put it on one of the chips, is about 30 amps on this card. Well, maximum, it's going to peak in, like, the 30 amp range, which basically means this VRM puts out negligible heat from the functioning of the MOSFETs. The driver ICs in that would still produce heat, and there'd still be other thermal losses, but just as far as the switching of the losses, like the switching losses in the MOSFETs and the conduction losses through the MOSFETs are going to be in the 1 to 3 watt range, which I think there might be an error. Like, the calculation I'm using for MOSFET thermal output doesn't seem to work very well at very low current throughputs, or these are just ridiculously efficient. One of the two. Though admittedly, the datasheet does say that if you're pushing small currents, then, like, these MOSFETs will, like, the dissipation of these MOSFETs in a zero airflow environment is like 2 watts or something. So this would actually line up with that statement from the datasheet. So again, the memory VRM is ridiculous overkill and comparable to some of the other VRM. Like, it is very similar in terms of capabilities to some of the other VRMs you will see on other 1080 Ti's. Though I think this one might be the strongest in terms of just power throughput. As far as regulation goes, it uses the UP1665, and I'm gonna need to go check something because I'm not entirely sure on that. Yeah, it's a 1665. So that's a two-phase voltage controller with up to 600 kilohertz switching frequency, which is, again, this is the same across most 1080 Ti's. They use a 1660 series UPI voltage controller. Well, actually, not even a 1660. It's a 16 series UPI voltage controller, and those are all made between 300 and 600 kilohertz switching frequency. So there's not really that much difference between this card and other cards in this as far as the memory VRM is concerned. So, yeah, that covers the two big important VRMs. Now let's get on to the shunt modding. You have shunts here, here, and here. So these two obviously are used for monitoring the amount of power going in through the 8 pins. So if you lower the electrical resistance of these using liquid metal or by soldering more shunts across them, you're gonna basically, the card is gonna think that it's using less power than it's really using, and that'll let you clock higher, assuming that you're power limited, which I do believe this card comes with a really, it comes with a over 300 watt stock TDP once you max out the slider. Once you max out the power slider, it ends up at 350 watts or something, so it might not, on this card, this mod might not really do anything. This one right here is for the PCIe slot. I'd probably leave that one alone if I were you. Also, if you're going to be shorting these out, I would short out both of these, because if you only do short out one of them, then you're going to end up messing up how the load is balanced between the two 8 pins. There's another way to do this power mod. Well, there's another way that you can do a power mod on these cards, but that one actually requires that you do soldering, and that revolves around this chip right here. That is a Texas Instruments 3-channel shunt monitoring little IC. So basically this monitors the current going through the different shunts on the card. If you want to, you can put a 10 ohm resistor across these capacitors here, and if you do that, it should cut your power readings by about 60%. But I'm not 100% certain about that. I've read about the mod, and the mod I know because, I know about this mod because Tin, who is a overclocker that works at EVGA, and he's also an electrical engineer for them, and he does a lot of the power design for the classified cards. He designed the e-power, that kind of thing. So he said that this is his preferred way of doing the power mod for 10 series cards instead of doing the shunt mod. Though really, this is not reversible. If you do it with the liquid metal, you can literally just take an alcohol, you can take alcohol and take the mod off anytime. If you're soldering onto capacitors, well, with my soldering skills, it's going to be really, really obvious that somebody soldered onto the capacitors. If you're better at it than me, then you can probably make it look factory new. But, yeah, if you're a beginner, I'd say liquid metal is your best bet for modding the card. Now, oops. There we go. Oops. So, yeah, that pretty much covers all the important VRM stuff. The card does have an HDMI connector right here, which is for VR, so that you can pass it to your front panel, which I think this HDMI connector right here is why Gigabyte went for the weird quadrupled 3-phase VRM control, because it does lower the amount of traces they need to run to the voltage controller, as it does at least save them the trouble of running PWM lines everywhere. But yeah, this VRM is odd. But as I said, for air-cooled and water-cooled overclocking, we're not, there's currently no difference between any of the custom cards in terms of overclocking capabilities. And as far as the VRM designs go, I don't think, they shouldn't really have that much impact. There shouldn't be that much variance between them, especially amongst the higher-end cards. So, you know, plenty of power available here on the Gigabyte card. Nothing to be really worried about. But it, like, I already compared it to the other cards throughout the video, so I think, I think you know exactly what I think about this card. It does not, however, have a BIOS switch, but none of the 1080 Ti's have a BIOS switch, which honestly makes me quite annoyed, because I'd expect that to be like a standard feature on a card that costs $700 plus. But, you know, and it's not like you can flash the BIOS with anything useful anyway, so. Though, no, actually, you can. You can. I heard you can flash BIOSes from different 1080 Ti's to, like, you can cross-flash the 1080 Ti BIOSes, because they all seem to be using roughly the same voltage controllers, which means they're basically cross-compatible BIOSes. So, and that can help you free up some extra power limit on some cards, which, if you're not sure that somebody else tested if you wanted to take this Gigabyte BIOS and put it on a Founders Edition, you don't know if unless somebody does it before you, you don't know if it'll work. And since neither card has a BIOS switch, you can't be sure that it'll, you're gonna have to use the difficult way of fixing a BIOS, which is to boot from another GPU and then hope that Windows notices the card still exists, which most of the time, you're not gonna have a problem with that. I've seen a few occasions where people have managed to trip BIOS write protection, and then you can't do anything without physically modifying the card, because BIOS write protection trips, and basically that means you can't actually, you can't write to the BIOS chip at that point, so you're kind of stuck. So that is it. At this point, the video is a little bit longer than I wanted it to be. Thank you for watching. Like, share, subscribe, leave a comment down below about anything you would like to leave a comment about. Do share the video, and if you would like to help out AHOC beyond just sharing, all my lovely videos, I have a Patreon and a PayPal. You can find a link to both of them down in the description below. If you have any more, let's say, pressing or important questions, you can also send them to my email at buildzoid, which is buildzoid@gmail.com. So, yeah. And by more pressing questions, well, actually not pressing questions, but say PCB photos and that kind of thing, send me an email about that, because if it's through YouTube's comments, it's gonna get lost. I'm not gonna be able to find it. It's just can't keep track of all the comments coming through and the YouTube messages. It's just hard to keep track of. So that's that for this video. Thanks for watching, and see you next time.